Epilogue. 3 years later. Tiffany. Tiffany squeezed Israel's hand as she glanced at the screen listing arriving flights. After a year of trying to get pregnant after their marriage, she and Israel had turned to adoption. It was a long and expensive process, but surprisingly, her parents had helped fund the process. She hadn't wanted to talk to them, hadn't even wanted to invite them to the wedding. But after listening to all the reasons why not, Israel had still insisted. It had been a bone of contention between them for a few weeks, but through their devotionals and her own prayers, she had come to realize he was right. She was holding grudges for events that had transpired years before. When she'd finally sat down and spoken with them, they'd apologized for trying to control her life and for not taking her dreams seriously. A tentative, shaky bridge of communication had been formed, and over time it had grown stronger. They'd financed part of the wedding and become a large part of her life since then. In fact, it had been her father who had first offered to pay for the adoption when he'd heard of their troubles. She glanced over at them now. They held hands as they too stared eagerly at the screens. Awaiting their first grandchild had appeared to bring them closer than Tiffany had seen them in years. "I can't believe this is finally happening," Tiffany whispered as people began streaming out of the gate. Somewhere in this crowd would be a woman with a baby. Their baby. "Me either." He kissed the top of her head before returning his gaze to the gate. Tiffany looked down at the diaper bag she'd packed that morning, hoping she had everything they would need. She'd remembered diapers, formula, a bottle, a binky, and burp cloths, but she was sure she had to be missing something. "There she is." Israel's excited voice pulled her gaze back to the gate, where, sure enough, a woman holding a baby carrier in her arms was coming their direction, a wide smile on her face. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez?" Mrs. Martinez. Even though she'd been Mrs. Martinez for 3 years now, the title still threw her off every now and then. "Yes, that's us. I assume you're Rachel Brown?" Rachel nodded. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you." She shook each of their hands before glancing down at the carrier she'd set on the floor. "And this is baby Alex. Of course, you are free to give him a different name if you choose. That's just what we decided to call him for the few days we had him. Unnamed baby boy just doesn't work in our office." As Tiffany stared down at the infant, she felt her heart swell in her chest. Israel might have been her first love, but this baby was already claiming a part of her heart as well. His eyes were closed, and his long, dark lashes fanned his tan cheeks. She tilted her head as something about his face caught her attention. For a moment, she couldn't figure out what it was, but then suddenly it hit her. "Oh my gosh, he looks like you, Iz." Israel leaned closer to inspect the baby, as did Rachel and her parents, who had crowded in to meet the new addition to the family. "Well, you're right. He sure does look a little like you, Mr. Martinez," Rachel said with a smile. "I guess God knew what he was doing when he put the 3 of you together." "He certainly did," her mother chimed in. She squeezed Tiffany's hand and added, "I guess we'd see more of God's right choices if we learned how to open our eyes and our ears better, huh?" Tiffany returned her mother's smile. She was so thankful that God had mended their relationship, and so thankful that Israel had pushed for it to happen. This was not the way she'd planned on starting her family, but she had to admit there was something special about gaining a child this way. And she would be sure to tell her son how much they wanted him, how he was extra special because they got to choose him. "There's just a few final papers to sign, and then you can take him home," Rachel said, rummaging in her satchel. "I'm sure you're excited to get your family settled." That was an understatement. From the first day they'd gone to the adoption office, Israel had begun painting and getting the room and the house ready. Because they hadn't known whether the baby they would get would be a boy or a girl, he had painted the room a soft tan color with green and yellow accents. The crib had been ready a few months after that, and long before they'd gotten the official word there was a child for them, the room had been complete, standing like a sentinel in wait for its charge. Israel signed the papers before handing them to Tiffany, who added her signature and then handed them back to Rachel. "Thank you so much for everything." Rachel nodded and wiped at the moisture pooling in her eyes. "You're welcome. And these are happy tears? It always does my heart good when we find forever homes for these babies. I can just tell that you two were made to be parents." Tiffany smiled up at Israel. "Well, we want a big family, so I'm sure you'll be hearing from us again." "I'll look forward to it." Rachel placed the signed papers back in her bag, smiled one more time down at baby Alex, and then waved goodbye before disappearing into the crowd. "Well, shall we get this little one home?" her mother asked. "I have some baby rocking to do."
"Yep, let me just send out a message before we go," Israel said,
and Tiffany knew exactly what that message would say. Their friends at the Patriot Peak Resort had been their extended family for the last few years, and they would feel slighted if they didn't get to see the baby on the first day. So she knew Israel was sending out a mass invite to come and meet the baby.
"Are we keeping the name Alex?"
her father asked as he looked down at the baby again.
"Maybe it's just me, but it doesn't seem to fit him."
Tiffany shook her head as she smiled at Israel. "We've already picked a name. When we found out we were getting a boy, we decided on Samuel Agapito. Samuel means God has heard, and Agapito means beloved. We figured it fit since God heard our prayers for a family, and this child will be loved more than he will ever know." Her father tried the name out.
"Samuel Agapito Martinez."
He nodded.
"I like it. It's a strong name, and I think he'll do it justice."
"Me too," her mother agreed. "Now can we get going? I have been waiting a long time to hold my grandbaby, and I'm getting a little antsy." Laughing, Israel picked up the carrier in one hand and grabbed Tiffany's hand in the other. It amazed her how complete she felt, even though Samuel had barely joined their life. Would every baby feel this way? Israel loaded the carrier in the car, and Tiffany forced herself to sit up front with him instead of in the back next to Samuel. She knew she would have plenty of time to bond, but she wanted to start now. As Israel pulled out of the parking lot, Tiffany's cell phone buzzed. She pulled it out, expecting it to be a message from Holly or Mary Beth that they were on their way. It was from Holly, but she wasn't on her way. Her forehead wrinkled as she tried to make sense of the message.
"What is it?"
Israel asked, picking up on her confusion. Tiffany shook her head. "It's Holly. She said she can't come today because an emergency came up, but she's been looking forward to meeting the baby for weeks. I hope everything's okay." He placed a hand on her arm and squeezed.
"Don't worry. I'm sure everything is fine. Holly is tough, and she knows to call for help if she needs it, right?"
Tiffany nodded. Israel was right. Holly was tough as nails, and if she were truly in trouble, she would have said something. Tiffany might have a baby now, but she would always be there for her friend. Their driveway was already filled with cars when they reached the house. Friends and family poured out, wishing them congratulations and vying to see the new addition. Baby Samuel was passed from one set of arms to another as drinks were poured and the food was devoured. And though Tiffany enjoyed all the company, she was relieved when they all went home and it was just her and Israel and the baby.
"God did good,"
Israel said as he stared down into Samuel's angelic face. "Yes, he did," Tiffany said, and sighed in contentment. This might not have been the way she pictured starting her family, but she took comfort in realizing that while she didn't always understand God's plans, they always worked out for the best. The end. Did you enjoy this book? Would you leave a review at your retailer to help other readers find the book? Want to find out what's going on with Holly? Be sure to pre-order Her Saving Grace today. This has been Her First Love, written by Lorana Hoopes. Copyright 2021. Narrated by Lorana Hoopes. Audio copyright 2021.